I'm joined here by County Attorney John Nona, Director of Operations Joan McDonald, and Deputy County Executive Ken Jenkins. We have other members of our executive administrative team here, notably our Chief of Staff, Andrew Ferris. We also have with us the Chair of the Board of Legislators, Ben Boykin. Members of the Board of Legislators, I see Nancy Barr, Mary Jane Shimsky are with us here today, and some other officials from both the board and the executive branch. When we finish our comments and any questions that relate to this topic, we'll be available to talk about any other topic that anyone in the press would like. For those folks who are here that are not members of the press, we'll take questions from the press first, and then when they're completed with any questions, then we'll take any questions from anybody in the room. And then you can certainly interview any individual one-on-one thereafter as you see fit. Today we're laying out a game plan at my direction that deals with how we are going to go about the process of making very key decisions at Westchester County Airport. Now, this administration has had 4.5 months on the job. During that period of time leading up to our State of the County message, which was a month ago today, we dealt with some of the issues that had been lingering in the past administration that were either matters of legislation or executive order. The gun show, the Immigrant Protection Act, the salary history legislation, executive order on ban the box, our open government initiatives, the good neighbor policy, and so forth. But I highlighted a month ago in our State of the County message that we had some major issues ahead of us and that we would be dealing with them in a very direct and straightforward fashion. I referenced that we had to look at the Playland arrangement, and a little over a week ago, we had a conversation on the McDonald-Nona report relative to Playland, and that process will play itself forward. We talked about the need to deal with shared services, and we had a major meeting last week to bring together the players in Westchester County to launch a shared services initiative. We talked about the budgetary situation that we have, both what we've inherited as we manage the 2018 budget, close out the 2017 budget. There's been a report which has been given to the Board of Legislators by our budget director, and that issue is going to play out. The airport is another one of those major issues that have to be dealt with, and so while we have dealt with the legislative issues and the executive order issues, we are now dealing with the significant policy issues that, frankly, we inherited on day one with a certain structure. So in the memo that we've given you and the press release that covers some of the bullets, we've broken this issue into 4 component pieces, and it's very important to see them as 4 pieces that are interrelated but are also standalone pieces that have to be dealt with. That is the master plan, governance of the airport, operations at the airport, and structural citizen involvement in the things that happen at the airport. During the course of the discussions over the last 2 years, the word privatization has been attached to a plan which in essence was to change the governance of the airport. So we use the word governance because that's really what the plan is. The plan, if it happens or doesn't happen, it is about changing the governance of the airport, who controls, and then if it changes, what kind of resources we might get for that change in governance. And since those proposals were the centerpiece of debate at the airport, we have unfortunately not devoted enough attention to the master plan and to the operational issues, which are the issues that I hear more about when I'm out in the community. How many flights are overhead, the noise, and things of that nature. And then, of course, the citizen involvement, which I believe has been weak, and we now need to make it more robust. And ultimately, if we have the right kind of citizen involvement in all of these policy discussions, then we can sort of move away from frankly, the lack of confidence that people in the community have over the way decisions are going to be made, have been made, and can be then made in the future. So let me deal with each of those areas individually, and I'll take questions when I'm completed with explaining all of them. First of all, in terms of the master plan. We had in 2012, with the prior administration, received $1.39 million from the federal government, the FAA, to develop a master plan on the airport. The last master plan was put in place, I believe, in 1989. It was a document that now has been well outstripped by changes in the marketplace and changes in pressures. However, for whatever reasons, and I wasn't a part of county government until January 1st of this year, the process to implement that money to do the master plan did not move at a proper pace. So by the time we got to the end of 2017, at the end of the prior administration, the master plan document, in my judgment, was insufficient and incomplete. It had not gone through the proper scrutiny of the Board of Legislators, did not have the Board of Legislators imprimatur, and there was not an appropriate environmental review on that document. Under normal circumstances, we would restart the process and continue to a full master plan analysis that would include those elements to it. But the FAA set a deadline of June 1st of this year to complete the master plan document and submit it. So we are nowhere near being able to complete that document under the original structure of the way we would operate. We explained to them as an administration that we could not possibly complete it by June 1st. We needed an extension. They graciously gave us an extension until July 15th, which is still insufficient time for us to be able to do the things we have to do. It would be an insult to the Board of Legislators to give them a document as exists today, decide by July 15th, and I certainly don't want to do that. However, the $1.39 million that we received is subject to clawback by the FAA if we don't submit a document that satisfies the original request for the funds. So our plan on the master plan is simple. There's an element of controversy to it, but I believe in the long run it will work effectively for what we want it to do. We will submit on July 15th the Astorino master plan to the FAA without prejudice. We will submit this as the response for the money that was laid out, which has been used as far as I understand, and we will then take county resources to complete a master plan supplemental document that will in essence revise the master plan as submitted until we have a full, complete new master plan that will have an environmental review attached to it and the discussion and hopefully the approval of the Board of Legislators at the end of that process. That process may take a year to complete, but at least what we will do is have the thorough review of all of the issues that, frankly, I don't believe got thorough review in the master plan. The master plan and the governance issues got combined in the public mindset, and we wound up talking about the deals on who would govern the airport more than what's in the master plan and what's deficient in the master plan as it is. We understand from the FAA that if we submit this document without prejudice, we will be satisfying the grant requirement. We will not have to give back the money. We're not in a position to give back a dime if we can avoid it, given our financial circumstances. But we will be able to craft a master plan supplement that will satisfy, I think, this administration's philosophy, the Board of Legislators, and, most importantly, the public input to the master plan process that has not happened. And to that end, and I'm going to jump ahead to the citizen involvement situation, we have established a meeting on Wednesday, June 6th at the Rybrook Village Hall, in which we will begin the process of the master plan supplement discussion, and we'll begin it by looking at the master plan as it is before us and identifying the areas of deficiency that individuals in the public, in the advocacy community, in the user community find necessary for us to amend and to strengthen or to change in whatever way is possible. That will begin our process. I will chair that meeting on the 6th. Members of the Board of Legislators, local officials, individuals are all welcome to attend it. We may have some capacity issues in the Rybrook Village Hall, but we are going into public rooms for each of these public meetings that are coming up, and we intend to accommodate as many people as we can. We know there's a great interest in this issue, and we intend to make this as open and as public a dialogue as is possible. So our intent, again, on the master plan issue is to develop a full master plan supplement document that will modify the master plan from the prior administration that we will submit on July 15th to satisfy the FAA requirement. And we expect that that discussion will modify whatever it is that we submit, have a final document at some point in time, a year down the line, maybe less, maybe more, that will represent the philosophy of this government and how we see the airport proceeding forward. The second issue, governance. In the last 2 years, plans to change the governance of Westchester County Airport have been submitted in the public domain in the month of November, baked into the county budget that was delivered to the Board of Legislators with a revenue stream that became contingent upon the approval of the Board of Legislators. And in both 2016 with the Oak Tree arrangement and 2017 with Macquarie, there was, in my judgment, insufficient time for the Board of Legislators to have a proper discussion of whether or not to change the governance. And it was done not as a policy matter, but it was done as a fiscal matter where you do this and you get revenue that you desperately need to balance the budget, or you do something else, which basically means going into your reserve fund to cover the budget and to balance it off. The 17 process was somewhat more inclusive because there was a task force of the Board of Legislators that discussed with the various entities that bid on the proposals. But the overall discussion as to whether or not it is wise public policy to change the governance of the airport has not been discussed by the people of Westchester County. That we will change. We have a meeting planned. This will be the second of our public meetings, and these meetings will repeat as we go forward on these three topics. And by the way, I want to highlight, When we have a topic for a meeting, that is the only topic we're going to talk about for that meeting. We'll have continuation meetings that will follow on that topic, but we can't blur the topics or we won't get through the guts of what the policies are. We intend to have a meeting, a community input meeting on the topic of governance on June 11th at the Hergenhan Recreation Center on Maple Avenue in Armonk. It's in the town of North Castle in the hamlet of Armonk. And at that meeting, we will begin the process to hear public opinions about whether or not we should change the governance of the airport. There are a couple of proposals that have been out there on the airport. We know in 2016, Oak Tree Capital submitted a proposal. In 2017, through an RFP process, Macquarie Development submitted a proposal. That's before us. The Oak Tree bid in the 2017 cycle. There was a third entity that bid in 2017 and a fourth entity that chose not to bid. There may be some other combinations of individuals that choose to suggest what they were capable of doing were we to change governance, but we are going to have a public policy discussion about governance in and of itself, followed by whatever discussions might be a specific governance plan should there be a will to do this. The Board of Legislators throughout this will operate on their own calendar as directed by their chairman and the majority of their members. If they choose to have their committees hold separate discussions, to certainly participate in any discussions we have, create a task force that is totally within the will of the Board of Legislators, the administration will work with the Board of Legislators in whatever way they structure the desired situation. But we as an administration need to reestablish faith in the analysis of the public policy. So we must have these public meetings in an ongoing basis. And if they're going to be 2 and 3 and 4 of them in each category, then there'll be 2 and 3 and 4 of them in each category, so that every person is heard and every idea gets proper venting as to whether or not these things are wise or unwise. It is my intent by mid-October to have dialogue with the leadership of the Board of Legislators to determine if a change in governance is warranted based on the public hearings that we've had, public meetings we've had, and on what types of proposals are on the table, any that might be modified. I intend to submit a budget to the Board of Legislators in November that deals with this issue on the basis of whether or not the board will entertain that policy or not. So if it is the will of the board, either by majority, informally or formally, to move in a governance or not in a new change of governance plan, we will not submit to the Board of Legislators a plan that they have not seen and drop it on them in the budget process of November, and then expect the community, the advocacy community, the citizens of this county to react in 30 days. That is not good public policy. We will not do it. We're changing directions from what we did before. We think the proper way to do it is the way we've laid it out. The third area is operations, and operations is a broad-based category that covers all of the different issues that relate to people who either use the airport as individual passengers for commercial airlines, or for those who are pilots and use the airport for general aviation, or corporate customers who are based in the county and have flight equipment out there, and then for the people who live in Westchester County, those who live within the flight path of the airport, which is a fairly large radius, not just the immediate 2 or 3 communities around it. All of those folks who in some way, shape, or form interact with the airport have operational issues that must be vented and must be addressed. We can talk about a master plan direction, we can talk about governance. We still have to talk about noise and noise abatements, flight paths, things that relate to the type of equipment that is being flown out of there, the altitude on the flight paths. We have to discuss the issues of FBOs, fixed base operators, and what their impact is on the airport, and how they go about making decisions for to provide their services or not. All of those issues under operational issues have historically been dealt with by the Airport Advisory Board and the Board of Legislators and the administration. So I want to make sure that we have a public discussion about those operational issues. I want to make sure that we hear directly from the public exactly what those problems are. My hope is that people out there have already been categorizing the experiences they've had, so when we ask them for records, they'll have records available so that we can try to track and deal with these. Some of the operational issues are within the control of county government. Some of them are not. And the ones that are not, we will have to deal with FAA and try to lobby them for changes that we think would be advantageous. This, by the way, is one more reason why we want to satisfy the FAA deadline. If we don't satisfy the FAA deadline on the master plan and they claw back money from us, they may very well be unresponsive to any other requests that we make of them. So we want to show that we're in this in a cooperative fashion And the changes that we will no doubt advocate for will be changes that come out of the dialogue on operations. And we've set a date for a meeting on operations, and that is scheduled, a community input meeting, that is scheduled for June 25th at 7 o'clock at the West Harrison Senior Center on Underhill Avenue in West Harrison. Now, in each of these 3 meetings, as I've mentioned, I will be chairing those meetings. All are invited to attend. All will be given an opportunity to make comments or ask questions as they see fit. I think we're making it a 5-minute time frame limit on your comments, which is relatively generous given what I expect the public turnout to be. You can certainly submit written, comments that are of any length and size. And I expect if at the end of the evening, and we will stay in session until the last person has spoken. This is not 7 to 9 and we shut the lights off. If it goes to 11 o'clock at night because there's enough speakers to 11 o'clock at night, I'm going to sit there until 11 o'clock at night. Everybody will be heard. If we have a continuation meeting, we will establish a continuation date, and we will probably put it in a different location so that we will also be in Pleasantville, in Chappaqua, in White Plains, in every one of these communities to make it convenient for people who feel that they have a vested interest in what's happening at the airport. But on the operations issue, there's a multi-headed element of this, and these are issues that I expect will be ongoing in nature, but we're going to identify them. Some of them we will address in the master plan, and some of them will be ongoing issues that the county administration will work to lobby to try to change to the extent that we can. The fourth and final one of these areas is specifically citizen involvement. I've touched on this already in my earlier comments. The first thing is we intend to announce new members for the Airport Advisory Board, and that we will announce a full slate by Friday, June 1st, which is half a month away, 2 weeks about or so. There will be changes to the Airport Advisory Board. We expect to have a full complement of members. There are a number of members who are designated by community. Some of those community members have been identified and as replacements or filling of vacancies. We have a couple of at-large memberships. We need to make sure that on Friday, June 1st, we will list all of those individuals. We will make the announcements of the appointments. Those appointments will go before the Board of Legislators for confirmation, and they will execute their normal diligence in terms of reviewing the qualifications of each of those members to determine if they're going to stay if their appointments are going to be endorsed and upheld. But the change of the Airport Advisory Board in principle is so that we get a group of individuals who are prepared to deal with these issues on an ongoing basis. I expect the members of the Airport Advisory Board who are signing on, they're not going to get compensated for this, but that they are going to be diligent in their outreach to the community because like all of our boards and commissions, which we're trying to revivify in every area of public policy in this county government, that is the voice of the citizens brought inside the government on these advisory boards. And we'll have other conversations about other advisory boards, but this one that ties directly to this facility is the proper place for many of these discussions to be held, in addition to whatever the Board of Legislators chooses to do, either in their general citizens to be heard or through their committee structure. In addition to this, I've mentioned the community input meetings. Let me mention them again. The first round of them, June 6th at Rye Brook Village Hall for the master plan discussion, June 11th at the Hergenhan Recreation Center, which is the senior center of Armonk on governance, and on June 25th at the West Harrison Senior Center on operations. And as I said, there will be continuation meetings that will follow that. To summarize what we're doing here today is we're laying out a process. In none of these things do I presume what the final product is going to be. I presume that the final product will be a combination of citizen input, legislative discussion, executive branch review, the professionals that we have that run the airport, and then ultimately public policy that will be set by the county executive and by the County Board of Legislators as a group. This, I think, is what's been missing in terms of dealing with airport issues. We have dealt with it as a place to get money. We've dealt with it as a place where there are objections by people who live near in the neighborhood, and sometimes those objections are taken into account, sometimes they're not, but we haven't had a holistic overview on these things. And I will tie it back to where I started from. We have a responsibility. I personally have a responsibility. I ran for this office. I ran against my predecessor. I was given the opportunity to try to govern this county for 4 years. In that governance, every one of these major issues has to be dealt with forthrightly. We are prepared to do what is necessary to get to what we think is the best public policy with public input on Playland, on the airport, on our union contracts, on shared services, on every single public policy that comes before us. If we make a mistake, it will be a mistake of implementation. It will not be a mistake of intent. And what we intend to do is change the dialogue on the airport, open it up for everybody's input, let the board and the executive branch together discuss these issues, come to closure through our budget process, and then as we go forward, hopefully, so that this facility, which is an important transportation hub, make no mistake about it, but at the same time is the biggest, most impactful neighbor for people who live in certain parts of this county, that it can accomplish both of those missions equally well. So with that thought in mind, I'm finished with my prepared comments. I'm happy to take any questions from the press, and then I'm happy to take any questions from anybody else who's in the room. Any members of the press wish to ask any questions? David.
Regarding the master plan, I know one of the things that was missing from the master plan, the last I was shown that was available, was that there wasn't any input from the public in the master plan that was to be submitted. And DY Consulting, my understanding, did not complete what they were asked to do. Now, is this master plan that you're submitting, will it include public comment in it?
Well, the master plan that we're submitting is exactly what the Astorino administration had completed through the end of their term. If we have anything that we can submit subsequently because we're starting our public meetings before we submit the plan on the 15th, we might include it. But we accept the fact on day one that the master plan that we're submitting is not a complete plan by our standards, and it doesn't include public input to the level that we intend to have it. So that's why we're beginning immediately a series of public input on these things, so that we have the public input that we feel is deficient in this. However, as I've said, we have to also make a decision that has a financial price attached to it. And I observe we're not in a position to lose up $1.39 million. So we believe that the supplemental process, which we begin immediately, will satisfy the public input and the debate about what direction we go in, and so that when we have a supplemental plan completed, approved by the Board of Legislators, that will be a plan that we look at. That will be the master plan as modified, and people will look at it and say, okay, that's a master plan that I can look at and live with. That's what we're striving to create. The master plan we're submitting is to satisfy a requirement of the FAA. We want to stay in dialogue with the FAA, and we don't want to lose $1.39 million.
So it will not include the comments that were made at the public meeting? Or any of the input
No, I didn't say that. I said we may well include the public comments that we have from now until we submit the plan, but we're submitting the plan on their deadline date of July 15th. How much public input we have that we're starting now that can be included may or may not support some of the principles in the plan. So we may include that, but we are focused not on the plan that we're submitting. We're focused on the supplemental plan that we're going to be creating going forward.
I just want to be clear.
Yeah, go ahead.
I
Yeah.
still haven't got an answer on this. But the master plan that the Astorino administration had completed did not include anything from the
Correct.
July public hearing.
Correct.
Is the one that you're submitting going to be the same as that?
Let me ask a question I'm sure anybody in my administration knows. Do we have documents that show us the input?
We do.
All right. Then I think it is realistic for us to include whatever was done from last year as well as part of the public.
Because they had not completed.
Right.
Right. But, again, David, we're looking at a reality, and the reality is, what do? We wanted a deadline that would give us a year and a half to complete the master plan. And then we could just say the master plan is still under discussion, and then we could redo all this stuff. We're not given that option. The option we have is lose the money on July 15th if we don't submit something. So we felt this is the best possible way, and building in meetings already to include that input, so that it's not a question of, well, we'll do this, and then sometime later on, we're going to public commentary right away, and to try to make sure that that public commentary drives the changes that we want to make in the document. And obviously, the Board of Legislators, because they're going to have to approve of it, are going to participate in the process, certainly to observe, if nothing else, so that they have an idea of what's happened. And I certainly encourage anybody, once these meetings are set, publicize them amongst the world that you each live in, so that people know this is, and these things are going to happen, and we'll go forward. Press questions before I get to Ty, and then Martin.
In terms of privatization, you call it governance. Do you have a position on it? I know during the campaign when you talked about how you were opposed to it. Has that position evolved? Are you open to it?
First, let me address the language and then the question. This is not a debate about privatization. It is a debate about governance. Why do I say that? Because the airport is privatized already. It is not government employees that run the airport. We have contracted with a private organization created for this purpose, Avports, to run the airport. It was a misnomer, and I think it was done to try to tilt the public debate about it, because privatization has a halo of positive vibe about it in some people's minds. When you privatize something, well, you're taking it off of the paying of it by you and the public, and you're having a private entity come in and pay for something. That's the perception of privatization. You present the plan that was presented both in November of 16 and a separate plan in November of 17, and you present it as a privatization plan when the airport is already privatized. What you're really doing is changing who decides what happens at the airport. It's the governance of the airport. Who governs those decisions? What will happen? Well, practical question. Who's going to decide how much you price the parking garage fees at? When you turn the power to make those decisions over to another entity, you have changed the governance of the entity to the other entity. So that's why I make that differentiation. Now let me go back to the core of your question.
Who decides that now, for instance?
Well, right now that's a discussion that is held ultimately within the power of the county government to make those decisions. Avports runs the airport, and they may make a proposal for us to change fees of all sorts over there. But ultimately, the county government makes that decision. Under the change plans that were presented, the change in governance plans that were changed, those powers would belong to the entities that we contracted with. So that's why I'm not trying to play games with words, but I'm trying to be accurate in what we're actually doing. When we have a public hearing, we're not just talking about, oh, it's privatization, it's nice, they're going to pick up. We're giving some other entity the ability to make decisions. So when somebody calls me up and says, the plane's overhead, if we've done one of those deals, we can't change that process anymore. We've given it over to somebody else. It's a change in governance, and because of that, it changes the way we would interact with the public. So that's why we've changed the dialogue on it.
So what are your thoughts on it?
So my general thought is that what we haven't done, and I would make the same argument as we made 10 days ago on Playland. When you make a decision to give up, from a public asset standpoint, the power to control a public asset, you're doing it for a reason. What's the reason you're doing it? Prior administration argued that for financial purposes, we must privatize our public functions. Why? Because we can't afford to run them ourselves anymore. That might have been the argument with Playland. What was the argument with the airport? We can't tap into the extra money that's generated at the airport for public purposes. So the only way we can do it is by giving up the control of it through this special arrangement made through the FAA, and therefore we can tap some of the money that's been accumulated there, but we have to give up control to do it. We have never discussed that policy, and my attitude is, if we're going to give up control of anything and let some other entity come in, I understand why they would do it. They would do it for a profit. As I said 10 days ago, I worked in corporate environments. We contracted for a variety of things. We're in it for profit. We're not in it for social programs. We're in it to make a profit. And that's why the private sector companies would do it. And by the way, I don't fault them for it. I don't fault Standard Amusements. I don't fault Macquarie or Oak Tree. They're trying to make money on it. What I question is, what is the standard by which we give up public authority? What's the basis for that? And if you're going to do that, since it is a publicly held entity now, you ought to have a public debate about what's the trade-off. So during the campaign, I expressed a concern at one level, or opposition to deals that were struck that I felt did not have that debate, did not have the give and take between what are you giving up in order to get what you think is of money. And so therefore I was critical of it. Now within the administration, we have a responsibility to look at these things. It's not just how I feel. So we do a deep dive into the Playland deal, and we see problems in it. We look at the airport situation prospectively, because there's no signed arrangements done. We said, before we get into this thing, if we do, before we get into this thing, have we really evaluated what we're giving up in terms of what we're getting? That's what we're trying to get at. We're trying to get at a public process so people can comment, legislators can comment with sufficient time, and then we decide what path we go in order to do it right. If I could rewrite the world, I would have done the master plan first before we ever discussed governance. The master plan itself should have been a completed document. It should have addressed governance, and then you can have a discussion about where you go. But that's not the world I'm living in. I'm living in a practical world in which I have to deal with what I've inherited, and so I think this is the best possible way to work through those issues. Martin?
What happens if the public comments, or what eventually the Board of Legislature decides runs counter to what is going to be submitted in the partially or almost completed master plan? doesn't, how?
Well, the supplemental plan modifies the original plan. So it's as if I gave you a first draft of a document, and I said, here it is. You asked me to submit this first draft. Here it is. It's done. I'm going to give you a supplemental rewrite as soon as I can. And you say, okay, George, now it's open-ended. I have a document. You've submitted the report that you wanted. Now I come back and I give you a revised plan, and the revised plan changes things around. This revised plan becomes the new plan. But you have a plan. You have something in your hands that justifies the $1.4 million that you put out. That's the rationale behind it. And I think that, and I'm not looking to rush the supplemental process, because I think, unfortunately, what happened is, and by the way, I was guilty of this when I was a student in school. The professor gives you a deadline date for the term paper. The night before, you're banging away at 100 miles an hour because you didn't plan your work in advance. So I'm guilty of this in my own life. But in this particular case, from the granting of the money from the FAA, we had sufficient time to have done this. We didn't do it, so we didn't do it. Now we've got to deal with the reality of being hard up against the deadline, and we have to submit the term paper. So that's the situation of it.
Excuse me,
Yes, John, and then I'll come back to David.
has the deal that the Astorino administration last proposed and it's been told that they are no longer being considered?
No.
Have you
Well,
eliminated-
let me frame where we are. The Board of Legislators had a deal in front of them which they could have accepted for the Macquarie proposal. They did not at the end of the year. They chose not to accept that as part of the budget, and they went into reserve funds, and they reserved the process of decision-making to the new year. The way I look at it is that Macquarie Development has put a deal on the table, and we will reach out to Macquarie, and we will say to them, we are now having a discussion about whether we're going to revisit whether we're going to do this governance change or not. And by the way, you submitted a proposal to us. Do you have any changes in your proposal? How would you feel? In the same way, there were submissions by other entities. I think those entities, if they choose to change their proposal, if somebody else decides to put another proposal before us, since we didn't adopt what happened last year, we're not bound to deal with just that proposal. However, there is one matter, and that is that money was submitted and then returned to those entities that bid and were not successfully advanced. So Macquarie's money is still in the county pot. The other ones that bid were returned to them, and we may be duty-bound to return Macquarie's money to them as well. I don't know what the amount of money is, but I think in fairness, if we're looking at this going forward, that we owe that to Macquarie, because they invested a certain amount of money, and they put money down as, in essence, as earnest money, as you would in a house. And if you're not going to get the house immediately, and we're still going to go through a process, we should return that. However, we are not eliminating anybody from consideration, but the first question is, do we do this at all? That's the first question. And then if we decide we're going to do that, if there's a consensus, if, Chairman Boykin says, Mr. County Executive, we have a consensus in the Board of Legislators that we want to do a deal like this, and we're prepared to do a deal under certain parameters. That becomes a process that we then look at. But going back to Ty's question, my initial reaction was, you can't do the deal until you've discussed the policy that underlies the deal, and we've never discussed the policy underlying the deal. It's been, here's a deal, this is what you get for it, and if you don't do this deal, you now have a hole in your budget. That's not exactly the same as discussing the concept of whether we should do a deal or not.
Follow up, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that the county airport needs to expand to serve
No.
Westchester?
No, I would not expand the airport. The airport was meant to be a regional airport. The demand for that airport, were we of an expansive mindset, that airport could expand dramatically. The market for that airport to its east into Connecticut is conceivably unlimited. And if we were of a mind to expand the airport, it could become a tremendously larger size. I don't think that's in keeping with our commitment to Westchester. The stipulation agreement from 30 years ago was an agreement to limit the amount of commercial flights out of the airport. We now have a general aviation, corporate jet reality that we don't have the same kind of direct control over. But certainly, we know that the airspace over New York City expands in such a fashion with LaGuardia and JFK, the two busiest airports in New York State, so much so that Westchester County is the third busiest airport in New York State, busier than Buffalo, busier than Syracuse, much bigger cities than we have. So my intent is not for us to expand. And I don't think, given the laws that we have in front of us, that we need to discuss expansion. But how we control it and manage it within our authority, And how much of that authority belongs to the FAA is really what the push and pull on this situation will be.
That includes flights, right?
Well, it would primarily be flights, although there's other elements of expansion as well. But we have a no expansion policy. We're not looking to expand. Now, if somebody said to me, George, you're expanding the airport by putting a Starbucks in it, I don't see that as expansion. But certainly anything that deals with more flights, runway, what amounts to more air traffic that we incentivize by our actions, that would be expansion. Expanding certainly the footprint of the airport would be expansion. And it would be a negative idea. We've got a watershed sitting right out in front of it. You've got a drinking watershed right down the end of the runway. You know, what decisions we make have to keep that in mind. We drain off into the Long Island Sound. And we have pollution, speedies permits for sewer treatment because of the quality of the effluent and the water down in the Long Island Sound. We can't not take those environmental impacts into account, which, by the way, is why you have to do an environmental review of this property. This is a very sensitive piece of property. And it's, we're not out in a wheat field in Nebraska. David?
Two questions. One is if you have a estimated cost for the supplement to the master plan and the environmental review that you're going to do. And then two, one of the issues in the public trying to understand what's going on there is that the administration, both the previous and the current, has not allowed the Macquarie deal to be, the public to see the details of it. I made a request to see the deal. No, we couldn't see it. When this public discussion ensues, will the public be able to see, because the Macquarie deal shows you what we would be giving up, where we've all been in the dark.
I didn't realize, we did not release Macquarie information?
It was not released
No,
at the last
no.
administration.
Is there
in the Board of Legislation.
within our administration, is there a restriction legally from releasing that information?
I think we should check with Macquarie, but I don't think there's a restriction if Macquarie.
So let's do this in that one point, David. It wasn't my understanding that we had not released that information. I thought it was public information because it was a lease that was submitted to the board. We'll check through John. Anybody in the press, as soon as we know if we have a restriction, if we somehow signed an arrangement, fine.
Your administration has denied my request.
Okay, well then we'll find out why, and
It
we'll.
was
see if
based
it's-
upon the last, I think, the Board of Legislators' decision not to release it, but we'll revisit that decision.
Well, we're going to revisit that. This is new to me, and so we'll revisit that decision. If there is a legal reason why we can't do it, then we'll tell you what it is. But if there's no legal impediment to do it, then we'll release that and anything else we've gotten, because that is part of what we intend to discuss at the governance meetings. What was proposed, and the public needs to see what it is in order to know whether it's good or bad. So your point, I agree with your basic principle, and so you'll look at that, John. You'll advise us, and then we'll advise the press through Catherine. If it is possible to release any of these documents, if they're not for some reason propriety, then we'll release them appropriately to all members of the press, and obviously to any advocate that wants it to.
David,
Anybody
was
wants to
that
see
a FOIL
it.
request that you made? Okay.
Yeah.
Question, will you be involving the town of Greenwich on a thorn in the side of any?
That is a good question, which we haven't considered. So let me ask my staff person, Andrew First, would you reach out to the town of Greenwich, let them know what we're doing, so that they too can be a participant in it? And they should be as neighbors to the airport. Thank you. We had not considered that. The world ends the minute we cross the dotted line on King Street. So, but thank you for that input. Jonathan, I'll get you in a second. I just want to make sure I get everybody else in the press. Yes, sir.
When's the last time there was a review of the operations, and was there anything that was concerning that jumped off the paper to you that you now want to?
Well, from our standpoint as a new administration, as you can appreciate, we're trying to get our hands on a host of different things. Hugh Grecian as the Commissioner of DPW, is the department head that has ultimate supervisory responsibility over the airport. Now, keep in mind, when I served as a county legislator, when I left here in 2004, there was a separate transportation department and a separate transportation commissioner. In the intervening years, the transportation department was put under the DPW department. I'm not sure that's a wise decision. I'm sure it was a cost decision, but the basic function of DPW is really very different from the basic function of transportation. So Hugh, who came on board in February, has had to get his hands on a host of DPW issues, all the capital projects and a host of things with an undersized staff. So if we haven't gotten to the degree of review of these issues, then that's certainly on our task to be done forward. Hugh reports directly to Joan as Director of Operations. She spent time and energy looking at some of these issues. But under those operational issues, for example, because I've had involvement in some of this, when I was a county legislator, I was in the next door district, the one next door to Nancy Barr's district, the Catherine Parker district. There was a host of questions in those days about noise abatement equipment, things that would track noise and where they were placed and how modern they were they working. That's just one component of operational issues that I couldn't tell you today where we are with those things. And ultimately, I'd like to see the Airport Advisory Board be the agent on those things, because they're in a position to deal with these issues all the time, even as we deal with a range of issues. So I would say, just in general, we haven't gotten to where we need to be in terms of understanding the operational concerns over there, and I think these public meetings that we're going to start with in a few weeks will open the door to 1,000 issues. By the time we're finished doing these things, even if there's a couple of rounds of these meetings, we're going to have a grocery list of operational issues this long, and then we're going to have to parse through them individually, determine which ones we can directly control, which ones will take negotiations with FAA, and which ones may take money and resources, which we may have in the airport, we may be usable from the airport funds, it may not be. We'll have to determine all of that. Any other press questions? Okay, Jonathan, you're up.
It sounds like the primary reason for submitting the master plan as currently written by the Asperino administration is to avoid paying back the $1.4 million. The airport has a fund balance of over $20 million. Likely it seemed that money could be used to pay back the FAA. So why isn't that being done? It sounds like you're concerned about the county budget impact. And does that imply that the supplement will have a cap of $1.4 million on it?
It implies nothing in terms of what we're going to spend on going forward. We are concerned about the $1.4 million, Jonathan. We're concerned about every dime that we spend now. We already have a budget deficit that we've inherited that's significant, and we haven't yet negotiated the CSEA contracts, which are going to be a huge number whatever we settle it. So the dollars do matter. I don't think there's an impediment in us sending in the master plan as it is now if we are actively engaged in a modification to that master plan. I think it becomes a semantical concern rather than a real concern if what we're doing right now is the same thing we'd be doing otherwise. We would be having public meetings, we'd be getting public input, we'd be modifying public decisions that may be included in the master plan. We would be re-researching issues if we don't think those issues were accurately affected. As far as the tapping into the money in the airport budget, we are told that we cannot use that money to repay FAA. So that's our understanding of the situation. Go ahead, and then we'll go to Susan. No, it's okay. We'll go, and then we'll go.
So the previous master plan is about 6 years has gone on since that was started now. What guarantee does the public have that a better master plan that actually includes public input will be completed before your administration ends?
Well, assuming I have a full administration, you can never tell how long I'll be at this podium. I've made a public commitment that we will go through the process and complete the plan. You have no guarantee ever, whenever you start one of these processes, that they will end in a timely fashion. But I think I've shown on other public policy issues my intent. When I said in a campaign that we would get rid of the gun shows, we got rid of the gun shows. When I said in a campaign that we would restructure the human rights commissions, we did that. You had no guarantee on January 1st that I was going to do these things until I did them. And so now that's the same commitment that you have from us today. And if we were talking about prospective public process that would begin at some point in time later in the year, you might have reason to say, gee, how serious is this? We begin this public process as quickly as we can right after Memorial Day. We're a couple weeks from Memorial Day. And I think you'll watch the progress. I have no doubt you're going to be at each of these meetings. I have no doubt you're going to express your thoughts. I have no doubt that you're going to be very involved in the Airport Advisory Board in some capacity or another. So I think you and other advocates are going to see that you have full opportunity to try to shape public policy. But what I would say is that we're going to listen to all voices. So your voices are important, and everybody else's voices are important too. And I want to make sure we listen to everybody's voice so that when we have a final document and it's amended in a way that we feel is compatible, we're not going to have unanimity, but we're going to have a general consensus that we've listened to the public and we've absorbed it. Certainly, none of that has happened to this point. And what we do is going to be infinitely better, I think, than what you've seen. But look, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So you're going to have to see the pudding, you're going to have to taste it and determine it for yourself. Susan?
I have a question about the water contamination that was discovered in the last administration and that DEC wanted to have a resolution. So that needs to be addressed, in my opinion, whatever's going on with the
Right.
other stuff. So
I'll have John Nona address that because he's been working on that particular issue, perhaps Joan as well. This is an issue that certainly will be discussed in the operations table, but we are actively working on that right now as they huddle to determine.
I hate to stump you,
I think you're referring to the discovery of the PFOAs, which was chemical used in firefighting foam by the Air National Guard, which left the airport in 1983. So it's an old problem that has just recently been discovered in the last couple of years with this testing for PFOAs and chemicals like PFOAs. We are currently in discussions with the Department of Environmental Conservation with respect to entering into a consent decree to deal with remediation of the PFOA issue, which is still in the process of being examined as to how extensive any of that contamination might be. So that we're in active discussions with the Department of Environmental Conservation.
There was an article in Politico yesterday about the Trump administration suppressing data on research on PFOA and PFOS. I don't know if you're familiar with that report that came out about a study that was.
I saw a reference to it, but there's plenty of information out there on PFOAs and PFOSs. In fact, we also learned there is a Department of Defense fund available to help clean up these issues. And in fact, the Newburgh Airport, Stewart Airport, have already tapped into those funds. And we are making active efforts to make sure we're on the list to obtain funds if and when we need them for cleanup.
Yep, nope, that was it.
Okay. And these are discussions that we're having with the state DEC
Yes.
at this point on it. So
Regularly.
we think that our dialogue with the state DEC will be productive. We're all concerned about what the federal policy will ultimately be on these things. But for right now, if the DEC is going to supervise and make sure that something is done to the proper cleanliness level that's necessary, we intend to do. That was my comment to you, David, when you asked me back second week I was in the administration. We will do whatever it takes to clean it up because we recognize the proximity to the watershed and also that which drains out to the Long Island Sound. Either way, it's not a good thing, and we'll do whatever we have to do as the professionals direct us. There was a hand up over here. Yes, ma'am.
This is a comment. First of all, I'm very thankful that the Airport Advisory Committee, they're going to be changes, if I could say it as kindly as possible. The most biased committee I've ever attended and clearly not taking in public opinion. But in terms of operations, at the last meeting, they continually have received, instead of 62 noise complaints, it's more like 1,700. And they discounted it and sort of implied to me politely that we were making these up because the noise monitors do not support that. And so the question came for the first time, are their noise monitors working? Because they were at this advisory board thinking that we are all against what you call privatization, so we were making up these noise reports, which we are not, because their noise monitors do not support the data. So I just wanted to make that comment because
Right.
I think these monitors have to be.
Well, first of all, as we spoke at the Chappaqua Town Hall with Mike Kaplowitz and myself, the Coffee and Conversation, I take those accounts seriously. During my prior tenure, county legislator, assemblyman, senator, I've represented the airport or near the airport in all of those positions, and I've heard numerous complaints, and I have gone out many times to stand on somebody's front lawn to listen for myself. I haven't done it in Chappaqua or Pleasantville, but I've done it in other communities, and I've sat there and looked up, and I've seen plane after plane, and I've heard the noise with my own diminishing hearing. So I don't discount them on a personal level. I think perhaps the change in personnel on the advisory board that comes will make the advisory board have a different response, not necessarily specifically to a specific complaint, but in general more sensitive to it. As one example, the Newcastle Town Board recommended Robert Fleischer to this board. Michael Kaplowitz, the legislator for that district, recommended him. And while I don't want to roll out the appointments one at a time, on June 1st, I'm going to appoint, or will have appointed, the person who was recommended by Newcastle. That seat's been empty for a number of years. And so has a seat in Mount Pleasant, and so has a seat in Rye Town. So as we fill the board up, we make some changes in some of the at-large things. What I hope you'll see is in a future visit, you will see an airport advisory board that will not necessarily assume that everything you say is correctly, but they'll treat you with respect, and they'll verify whatever. And part of what the verifying whatever is, where are our noise abatement monitors? Are they operative? Are they the state of the art? Are they located, if they've changed flight paths, and I'm told they have changed flight paths up there. Are the monitoring things, have they been moved to reflect the new flight paths? I don't know any of those things. That's what we're going to try to get to.
I visited the one that's one block from my house.
Okay.
The neighbor found it, and so it's under the flight path.
Right.
transmitter blew was on that same pole with this noise monitor, but people on that street, because we saw the planes, they're going every 4 minutes.
Right.
It can't be, you know, but
Right. Well, I don't doubt that if you lost power, that the monitor lost power, and you're not. So I don't doubt that. But my point is the generic thing, that we changed the Airport Advisory Board. We have a more robust group of members who are interested, willing to look at these issues afresh. I've already identified that the whole question of airport abatement material and equipment is necessary one, and I think we start to move closer to be able to track it. Any effort that we have to convince the FAA to make any adjustments to the things that are within their power will only come if we have accurate data. And so rather than questioning the data, we have to verify whether the data is or isn't accurate, and then, is the equipment appropriate? Is it modern enough? Is it pointed in the right direction? Is it placed in the right location? There's 1,000 of those questions to ask. And again, as county executive, I might come out to your lawn and stand there and, listen for my purposes, but I can't do it at all the lawns. So my hope is that the Airport Advisory Board will do that. And also your county legislators. The fact that Nancy is here, Nancy represents communities all around the airport. I know she's very engaged in this issue. And I know that Margaret Kunzio, who represents in areas, and that's it. Ben represents a portion of that right by it. And working through the legislators and the Airport Advisory Board, I hope you'll see a different response to your concerns. How we correct the concerns are yet ahead, depending on who makes the final decisions of how these things are done. And some of the decisions are within our control. Some of them are not. And we'll have to parse out that so we know exactly what it is.
County Executive, do you want the airport to raise more revenues for the county than the Astrino?
I think that's an issue that we'll deal with as we get down the line. I'm not looking at the airport as a revenue generator. I'm looking at it as a transportation facility that has an impact on the environment and the neighborhood around it. Those issues are primary in my mind. How does it function as a transportation center? How does it function as an environmental presence? And how does it function vis-a-vis the neighbors? The amount of revenue that it does or can generate is, below tertiary in my way of thinking. That's why I won't put the money ahead of the discussion of governance. Otherwise, then the money is the first issue in which everything else goes by the wayside. So I move to a press. Let's go to Nancy. I know we're going to wrap this up in a second, but go ahead. Legislator Nancy Barr.
Thank you. This is a practical question, and thank you very much for setting up dates for meetings for the public to have input. But in order for the public to have input, I'm just wondering what should the public simply look at the master plan that's going to be submitted to make comments at the first meeting, or it might be more useful, for example, if there were sort of a set of questions from the county saying, how do you feel about this, or what would you like to see in 20 years, or something to guide the
Well, we can certainly provide certain information, and we'll provide it to you, and you can then circulate it through social media, mass email, whatever you and your staff can do. We will certainly try to provide background information. Maybe we'll bullet, synopsize what's in the master plan right now so that people have it. David has written extensively about this in the press, and David, if you have some of this in your social media where you've done this analysis and you want to send it along, we'll put it back out there so people can see it. I think one of the problems, though, is that when you give a list of questions, you tend to guide the discussion a certain way. I'd rather bullet topics and let people determine than what they want to comment off on the topics. So, that would be the way to look at it. But I'm going to, I guess this will be tasked with Catherine Chaffee and myself and with Andrew Ferris, and we'll sit down and we'll determine what kind of information we can put out beforehand. I've called them community input meetings because I don't know what kind of input we're going to hear, how much volume, what direction it's going to go. I'm going to chair those meetings because it's going to be sort of open-ended. I don't want members of the Board of Legislators to walk into just this open-ended thing. I'm prepared to do that. But then as a legislator, you can start to parse through what you think are the public policy issues that you want to see in the master plan, given the general input that people give. And the general input may wind up being somebody walks in the door and says, I've got planes coming over my house every 4 minutes. Well, how does that relate to the master plan in that particular discussion? Because that's more of an operations question. But it's going to be my job to traffic cop the input. And some people are going to get upset. I want to talk about this now. I understand you do, but we have to cover a certain amount of ground on the master plan. And if we don't do that, then we're not going to be doing our diligence toward that document. So I'm going to try to nicely direct the dialogue in each of these 3 sessions and in any of the follow-up sessions accordingly. All right, Jonathan, you get the last word. By the way, congratulations. We understand you have a beautiful baby, Sophia. We're all very happy for you and Karen.
Thank you. Naturally, the interest of neighbors to the airport and aviation users are in opposition. Obviously, people who are upset about airplanes over their house want there to be fewer airplanes. And as the public input process proceeds, how would you weight those different interests? So, would someone who lives in Chappaqua who has a plane going over their house every 2 minutes carry more weight than someone from Manhattan who uses the airport to, go to Nantucket on the weekend?
Right.
And how would you verify at these public comments sessions, who's who?
Right. Well, first of all, I think we take everything in the front end open-ended. We see how much volume we get of which things. You're asking a legitimate question, but you're really asking a question that goes to the heart of anybody who's in public office. In my comings and goings over 31 years now, I have interacted with an unbelievable wide scope of people. And in any 2 consecutive inputs, I will get 180-degree positions expressed to me. I'll speak to person A, and they'll say, you should have the death penalty. Person B will say you should never have the death penalty. And what I have to determine in the volume and in the degree of intensity and the way some people have nuanced positions and they can explain it more thoroughly, some people don't, is to try to figure out what is the essential will of the people expressed through all of this raw input. We had an election last year. 43% of the people voted for my opponent. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people who probably don't think anything I'm doing is right and probably won't ever support it. They have a right to tell that to me, and I have a responsibility to listen. I have a responsibility to listen to the 57% of the people that did vote for me and then determine somewhere in between which portion of that electorate is moving on an issue one way or the other. So I can't tell you how we're going to actually weigh it out. There's no formula to do it. But I do think that the only way to do it effectively is to have multiple numbers of these meetings. Because keep in mind, while we're having these meetings, separately, we're having some meetings on shared services out there. Separately from that, I'm having coffees and conversations in other communities. And sometimes, if you go to Yonkers, you may not get anything on Playland or the airport, but you might. And that's really what the challenge of public leadership is. And then ultimately, you decide if I've chosen properly. You decide. This administration, people that I've asked to come and serve, and they've agreed to come and serve, they have a responsibility. But at the end of the day, I'm accountable. I'm the guy accountable for whatever decisions they make. And just as you have legislators that are accountable. So I'm going to try to be as inclusive as I can. I'm going to try to listen. I'm going to ask questions, too, by the way. These public hearings, if you, and I'm sure you will, get up and you ask these questions, I may be in the position of asking you, not to put you on the spot, but to clarify your thinking, because you are a pilot as well as a neighbor. And so you do fall into a couple of different categories of assessment of this. And in order for me to try to come to grips, talk with my team, talk with the legislature, be responsive to the press, all of these things will come out of this process, and then ultimately we're going to make some decisions. And then you'll hold us accountable for those decisions. With that, I have to make it the final word. If you want to chat with anybody individually, you're welcome to do it. Thank you for your time. To be continued. If nothing else, I'll see you on June 6th.